Happy to be here today to talk about my new book, Love, Sex, and Marriage in Colonial America. The English colonies in North America, which were eventually to become the United States, developed their own idiosyncratic customs regarding love, sex, and marriage based on local circumstances. While the basis for all of these attitudes can be traced back to the mother country, local variations occurred because of the varying temperaments of the original settlers. The Puritans of Massachusetts had a very different way of looking at sexual matters than did the more freewheeling Cavaliers of Virginia or the trappers along the western borders of North Carolina. Then, as now, one size did not fit all. The first permanent English colony in North America was established here in our very own Virginia at Jamestown on May the 14th, 1607, by the Virginia Company of London. Now, the party consisted of 104 men who came to America not to settle, but to become rich. Well, within a very short time, it became apparent to the colony's sponsors that their great venture in the New World was in danger of being wrecked on what contemporaries called the shoals of dissolute and irresponsible manhood. The Virginia Company's London recruiters began searching for women of marriageable age, offering free passage to Virginia and trousseaux for girls of good reputation. New husbands reimbursed the company with tobacco when they chose a bride. The first shipment of 90 so-called tobacco brides arrived in Jamestown in the spring of 1620. The youngest was 15 and the oldest was 28. Now, some overeager British merchants hired to provide the colonies with wives began simply kidnapping any young woman who came to hand. Well, as time went on, most of the single women coming to the Chesapeake Bay colonies came voluntarily, selling themselves as indentured servants. They repaid the cost of their passage with a term of 4 or 5 years in service. At the end of the indentured period, the women were supposed to receive food, clothing, and tools to give them a start in life, and then to emerge into a world filled with wife-hungry young men and take their pick. Many considered this not a bad bargain. Men outnumbered women by roughly 6 to 1 in the 1620s, and by 4 to 1 in the later decades of the 1600s. Well, over a quarter of the early male settlers along the Chesapeake Bay never managed to find a wife. And women were very aware of the advantage that the unbalanced gender ratio gave them. Men complained bitterly about hard-hearted and evasive women, and Virginia passed a law prohibiting women from promising themselves to more than one suitor. Okay, one of the questions that often comes up is, was there premarital sex in colonial America? Well, in neither England nor the colonies was there general agreement as to when a couple might justifiably become sexually intimate. The Church of England taught that couples must wait until after they were formally married. But many common folk considered unmarried sex to be unobjectionable if the parties had agreed with each other to marry. Well, in an attempt to quash popular assumptions regarding the acceptability of premarital sex, Puritan leaders in Massachusetts insisted that marriage was a civic responsibility to be regulated by government. New England couples planning to wed had to give public notice of their intention and then formalize their union in the presence of a government official who was licensed to marry. Some town courts taxed bachelors and self-supporting women for evading their civic duty to marry. Couples engaged in premarital sex ran the risk of being disciplined by their church congregations or punished in court for knowing each other carnally before they were married legally. More than 150 couples living in Essex County, Massachusetts, for example, were convicted of premarital sex between 1640 and 1685. Elizabeth Denham, a member of Boston's Second Church, was indicted in 1691 for, quote unquote, having an infant born within too few weeks after she was married. Stephen Johnson, who belonged to the same congregation, was disciplined in 1702 for having, quote unquote, sinfully conversed with her who was now his wife before she were so. Floggings and fines were imposed to deter couples. New England courts remained actively involved in the regulation of unmarried sex through the first half of the 18th century. For example, between 1731 and 1737, 24 married couples were presented to the Worcester County Court in Massachusetts for having conceived children prior to wedlock. Punishments, however, were becoming lighter over time as the Puritan hold over the colony dwindled. In Essex County, the average fine fell more than half by 1785, and no couples were whipped for the offense after 1725. Let's look at courtship. Courtship practices among American colonists were much more liberal than those in Europe. Thomas Ainbury, a lieutenant in the British Army, noted that young folks were accustomed to go a-frolicking, setting off in the evening to dance and carouse in groups of 30 or 40 without adult supervision, a practice that he noted would be esteemed extremely imprudent in England. Frolicking included work-related gatherings, such as quilting and husking parties, parties to celebrate elections or other significant occasions, snowball fights, and sleighing. Martha Ballard of Hallowell, Maine, worried when her young folk, who had gone off to a husking and quilting, came home late. Courting also took place at organized functions such as dances, horse races, and of course at church. Now, dancing was a very important courting ritual among the wealthy. It was considered a good way to determine a potential marriage partner's physical soundness, as well as the state of their teeth and breath. Dancing taught poise, grace, and balance, especially important to women who had to learn to remain in their compass, or the area of movement allowed by their voluminous clothing. Balls often lasted 3 to 4 days and took all day and most of the night. They were the primary means of socializing in the South. Now, outsiders observed in the Southern elite a different standard for men and women. And they commented on the sharp contrast. Timothy Ford, a New Jersey lawyer who moved to Charleston in 1785, wrote that the ladies there were circumscribed within such narrow bounds of acceptable behavior that they carry formality to an extreme. Young gentlemen, in contrast, were expected to be abandoned and debauched. It wasn't easy being a woman. Conduct manuals appearing in the late 18th century advised young women to steer a middle course between undue familiarity, which was dangerous, and cold reserve, which made them undesirable. Well, courtship inevitably led to marriage. Smoothly engineered marriages among the wealthy required that children recognize suitable marriage partners, weeding out frauds, rakes, and gold diggers. The successful transmission from parents to child of standards of quality, breeding, and social position prevented children of the elite from straying too far from people to whom their parents approved. Marriageable age in the South was considered to begin at 14 for women and the early 20s for men. So let's have a look at marriage. American colonial society placed the family, headed by a man, at the center of the social order. Families were defined as little cells of righteousness that held a watchful eye over the conduct of every individual and enforced the laws of God. Men were expected to marry, produce offspring, enjoy the companionship of a chosen wife, and head an orderly household. Well into the 18th century, dominant marriage ideals stressed that love emerged over time, largely following rather than preceding the wedding. The popular sermon, A Wedding Ring, reminded 18th century Anglo-Americans that harmony was the foundation for a good marriage. The ideal man was married, strong, and controlled. Now, husbands bore the brunt of responsibility for happy marital relations, including sexual relations. Colonial society acknowledged female sexuality, including the sexual needs of married women whose intemperate longings a husband was duty-bound to gratify. Sex was essential to the Puritans' notion of a healthy marriage. Refusal to engage in sexual relations with one spouse could lead to a disciplinary hearing at the local church or even judicial prosecution. James Maddox was excommunicated by the Boston congregation in 1640 for having, among other things, quote, denied conjugal fellowship unto his wife for the space of 2 years together. John Williams of Plymouth Colony was summoned to court for refusing to perform marriage duties towards his wife according to the law of God and man. The Puritans believed that both sexes should experience delight during sexual intercourse. According to the medical and marital advice literature of the time, procreation could not occur without female orgasm, which required that a woman become sexually aroused. Marriage and family were serious matters. Throughout the colonial period, bachelors were considered frivolous. True men married, became fathers, and headed households, while loose men who chose a single life, as one popular sermon of the time warned, fry in the grease of their own sensuality. Well, after the Revolutionary War, the issue of a tax on bachelors received serious consideration once again. Newspapers thundered that bachelors were not doing their duty to create these strong and stable households needed to build and expand a strong and virtuous republic. Another question that often comes up is, what about slave marriages? The English attitude was very different from that of their neighbor in America, the Spanish. The difference between the slave codes of the English American colonies and the slave codes operating in the Spanish colonies were striking. Spain recognized the slave as a person. The English colonies did not. As a legal person, the slave retained human rights over which the master had absolutely no power. In Cuba, for example, a slave's family was protected by law. A master could not outrage a slave's wife or daughter. A slave had recourse to law and had a right to legal marriage. In the English colonial system of chattel slavery, a slave had none of these rights. The slave codes of the English colonies did not recognize the validity of slave marriages. Marriage was voluntary on the part of the slaves and permissive on that of the master. Of course, then as now, not all marriages worked out. So how did divorce work? English common law, the basis of much American law, caused married women to suffer civil death by holding that in marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. The English jurist Sir William Blackstone summed up the matter when he said, "The husband and the wife are one, and the husband is that one." A wife's possession became her husband's, and she was unable to do business on her own, sue, borrow money, or sign contracts. Married women could not even claim their children in cases of legal separation. New England had the most liberal view of divorce. In New England, where the Puritans had defined marriage as a civil contract, secular law had provided for divorce as early as the 17th century. Marriages could be ended if either party failed to meet the obligations of the contract. Adultery, impotence, desertion, or conviction for serious crimes were all grounds for divorce. Additionally, wives could obtain a divorce on the grounds of non-support. In the other colonies, although women enjoyed some recourse in cases of unhappy marriages, options were limited. A woman could win a separate maintenance if a husband neglected or abused her, and it was clear that he was not fulfilling his husbandly duty to provide her adequately with clothing, food, and shelter, or if he was endangering her life. Once separated from her husband, a woman could try to make her own living, but her chances of achieving financial security on her own were not good. So most women, even if unhappy, either stayed in a bad marriage or ran off with another man. Among ordinary people, the ways in which relationships ended were often haphazard. There was rarely official religious or legal recognition that a marriage had collapsed. Maryland legalized divorce in the early 18th century, but the other southern colonies made no such provision in their legal codes. Any English subject could apply to the House of Lords in London for a divorce by means of a private act of Parliament. But such a difficult and expensive procedure was out of the question for most people. In most cases of separation, a husband and wife parted company without any formal ceremony. They might dissolve their relationship by mutual consent, or one partner might simply run away to live with someone else. The situation for elite women was somewhat different. An elite wife who found her husband abusive or their marriage unhappy could usually finance an informal separation whereby she could live with friends or relatives. Okay, so let's look at babies and birth control. Medical and marital handbooks of the day portrayed women's sexual appetites as debilitating both for men and for women. Supposedly, women had a shorter lifespan than men because they were much more amorous. In fact, it was childbearing in a medically primitive environment that killed large numbers of women. Cleanliness was not a high priority. Virtually no one bathed. What personal washing occurred was done from a basin. Most people simply scrubbed their faces with cold water. Elizabeth Drinker, a well-off 65-year-old Quaker woman in Philadelphia, bathed in a shower box that her husband set up in the backyard of their house and wrote, "I bore it better than I expected, not having been wet all over for 28 years past." Most physicians were self-trained. No medical college existed in the colonies before the Revolution. A lack of knowledge of the causes and cures of most diseases, of effective medicines and painkillers, and a lack of instruments such as the thermometer and the stethoscope handicapped colonial doctors. The practice of bloodletting for almost any condition was universal. Doctors also employed emetics, diuretics, and leeches, and the so-called cures often hastened the patient's death. Childbearing dominated the lives of women. The average woman in New England married before her 20th birthday and gave birth to about 7 children. 10 or more children were not at all uncommon. Benjamin Franklin was one of 17 children. In a culture in which women began to have children very young and continued until late in life, it was not unusual for mother and daughter to be pregnant at the same time. Well, John Carlyle, a wealthy merchant in Alexandria, had his life repeatedly scarred by the type of personal tragedy common in the 18th century. Of his 11 children, only 2 lived to adulthood. His first wife, Sarah, bore 7 children, 5 of whom died in childhood. Sarah died in childbirth. Carlyle's second wife, Sybil, bore 4 children, only one of whom lived to be 15 years old. This boy was killed while serving in the American Revolution. Bacterial stomach infections, intestinal worms, epidemic diseases, contaminated food and water, and just plain old neglect and carelessness all contributed to a society in which 40% of children fail to reach adulthood. What about birth control, you ask? Originally designed as a protection against syphilis, the condom came into limited use as a contraceptive in the 18th century. Condoms were usually made from sheep gut and were stocked by brothels and a few specialist wholesalers, such as London's Mrs. Phillips, who advertised to apothecaries, druggists, ambassadors, foreigners, gentlemen, and captains of ships going abroad. So you can see that these were really not used by the general population. Abortion, rather than contraception, was the primary form of birth control. Most available material regarding abortion relied on folk remedies to end pregnancies, such as bloodletting, It was hoped that bleeding from any part of the body might flush the room. Similarly, bathing was thought to wash away pregnancy. The high risk of falling down or taking strong purgatives to end childbirth were really not much more dangerous than the poor medical practices in seeing a live birth. Well, we're running a little short of time, so to learn more about love, sex, and marriage in colonial America, visit our website at www.timetravel21.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.